Okay, thank you, Laurel, and welcome everybody. I just want to start out by telling you what we're going to be talking about today, and then Laurel's going to sort of take it over on the annotation thing. So the title says Firearms and Protective Orders, what the new firearms laws mean for communities, advocates, and survivors. And I wanted to just let folks know that there were a number of new firearms laws that were passed by the General Assembly and signed into law that went into effect July 1 of this year. And what we're going to be focusing on today on this call is the Senate Bill 479, which relates to firearms and protective orders, because there's a lot that we as advocates need to know about this, and so that's where we're going to be focusing. We're not going to be talking about all the firearms laws. So I'm really excited to get to talk about this new law, and we will be allowing you guys the opportunity to answer questions as I go through this, but I'm going to ask that you hold questions until the end. So if you have a question that comes up on a slide, if you can just jot it down so we can sort of go back to those at the end to make sure we can get through all the information, that would be great. You can also use the chat if something comes up that you just feel like you got to say or you need to ask, and Laurel will be monitoring the chat, and she can, Laurel, please interrupt me if I'm rambling on and there's something that needs to be answered. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. So just a quick question to start us off is just to get a sense of where you guys are on your comfortability level around firearms and protective orders, and if you feel like you're pretty knowledgeable, you're pretty comfortable talking about them, or you're not quite so comfortable talking about them with your clients. So Laurel, can you explain how to annotate?
Yes, and I see a couple of folks have already figured it out. So I realize it's probably at the bottom of the screen for everyone else, but it looks different for me because so at the bottom of your screen, you will see a little pen or pencil icon, and it says annotate. And amongst the annotation options, you'll see a stamp one, which is what most people are using. And you can pick whatever cute stamp suits your fancy, and then click on the screen wherever you are vibing, whether that's with that very scared, sad face or that very happy green face on the right-hand side. And again, when you're done annotating, I encourage folks to hit the red X that's on that annotation toolbar so that you are done annotating. And it looks like we have a really wide range of folks' comfortability on today's call, more in the comfortable range, but like definitely getting down close to that red frowny face.
Yeah. Well, good. Maybe you, hopefully you guys can teach me something as we go through this next hour and a half. So. Yeah, and I'm really, one of the things that I would love to hear from you all as we get to the end of this presentation is how things are being implemented in your community, and as we go through what some of the changes are, if you all are already dealing with this in your community, if you have a CCR or you're working with the courts or law enforcement, I'd really love to hear what's happening, if there are good things happening or if nothing's happening. So yeah, feel free to share that as we get towards the end. Okay. All right, so yeah, a pretty wide range. So we'll go ahead and get started. So one of the things that I think is a really important thing to do, and something that I'm going to encourage community advocates and folks in your community to do, is to really work on doing some education around the connections between firearms and intimate partner violence. There have been a number of attempts to pass legislation over the last 20 years related to firearms and intimate partner violence. And we've just been successful in doing some of that here in Virginia. And we feel like it's really important that not only the professionals that you work with, but the general public understand some of the connections between firearms and intimate partner violence. So we're going to just go through a couple of quick statistics. So this is 2015, but it's pretty much consistent over the years. 56% of IPA-related homicides were committed with a firearm, and that's consistent in Virginia as well as nationally. So next slide. And one thing that if you work in this field that you're probably pretty familiar with is that if guns are around, that certainly increases the risk and potential lethality for victims. So when an abusive partner has access to a gun, a victim of intimate partner violence is 5 times more likely to be killed. We also know when guns are available that increases the likelihood of homicide. Okay, next slide. We also know that domestic violence assaults involving a gun make it 12 times more likely to result in death than when other weapons are involved or if it's just bodily force. So just this consistent knowledge and this consistent understanding that when guns are available in a volatile situation, that the potential for lethality really shoots up. Okay. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what you probably already know and give you some history of the progression of the bills in Virginia. So in Virginia, all protective orders require that the respondent may not purchase or transport a firearm or obtain or possess a concealed weapon permit while the protective order is in effect. And pretty consistently over the last 10 years or so, Virginia's done a really, really good job in prohibiting purchase of weapons from people who are subject to a protective order, because when a protective order is entered into VSEN, that information goes to the Virginia State Police, who, for all licensed gun dealers, can share that information about who's prohibited from purchasing a firearm. So in the past, that has only been to licensed gun dealers. So at gun shows and things like that, people could still purchase a firearm because they weren't required to check in VSEN or have that information available to them. And I believe one of the bills that got passed this year was one that closed that gun show loophole. And so any licensed dealer has to check about whether somebody's can actually purchase a firearm or not, so if they're subject to a protective order. And the transport piece of that has been enforced in a lot of different ways throughout the state over the years. There's some law enforcement that consider transporting it from one place in the house to another place is a prohibited activity, whereas other folks interpret that transport as transporting it in a car or going from place to place. But those have been pretty consistent. That if you're subject to a protective order, you have not been able to purchase or transport a firearm. Okay, next. So one of the things that is really important, and we really do want folks to do some education in your communities about the importance of firearm restrictions, is that these are really vital to protecting the health and safety of victims of intimate partner violence. And one of the challenges that we have is ensuring that these laws are consistently applied across the Commonwealth in every jurisdiction. And I think what we may get, if we could have some conversation about this, is an understanding and that these laws are applied pretty randomly throughout Virginia and depending on the jurisdiction, particularly in rural jurisdictions. But again, firearm restrictions are really valuable and important to ensuring victim safety. So.
And Ruth, I just wanted to verbally say to folks that Jonathan, our public policy director, went ahead and plugged into the chat a document with all of the laws that you're mentioning.
Yes.
So for folks who are curious about those laws, go ahead and check out the chat, and we'll make sure to send that out after the call.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I needed that. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Laurel. So again, just to give you a little bit of background, in 2005, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act required states and local governments who received VAWA funding, and that would be STOP funding, ICJR funding, and other federal money that comes through VAWA. It required states and localities to certify that the judge or the courts provided notification to respondents of both federal and state laws related to firearms and protective orders. So probably 15 years ago, I know in Virginia, we worked with DCJS and the Supreme Court to develop a brochure that had that information on it. One of the things that I've certainly learned over the years, there are courts now that aren't necessarily providing all of that information. They're going to provide the state laws on the actual protective order. So, but that's where it would be made available. So one of the first things that's important for folks to understand is that we really need to understand what these laws are and make sure that the respondents and the petitioners in protective orders are getting this information. Okay, next slide. So the federal requirements that outlaw or essentially say that firearms are restricted are any person who's subject to essentially a family abuse protective order, but it's an intimate partner violence relationship protective order, or any person who's convicted of a misdemeanor crime related to assault and battery against a family or household member, or a like crime where that individual is a spouse or a cohabiting partner or a former spouse. So, and those folks are not eligible to possess, purchase, possess, or transport a firearm. And those federal restrictions have been around for about 15 years. And we have had varying enforcement of those across communities in Virginia. Next slide. So one of the things that we've been trying to get the General Assembly to acknowledge and pass for a number of years is for Virginia to conform, for state law to conform with those federal requirements that went beyond just purchase and transport but actually included the restriction of possessing a firearm. So in 2016, legislation was passed to essentially make the possession of a firearm for anybody who was subject to a protective order a Class 6 felony. So that was what, we're in 2020 now, so four years ago, we actually did pass that legislation. And I'm really curious for folks who are on the call too, to know if in your community, you actually things were put in place to implement that, the passage of that law. Because one of the things that I know in having conversations with both law enforcement officers and with advocates around the state is there had been no change around protective orders and the purchase, and respondents did not necessarily know that they could be convicted of a Class 6 felony. So there were really no mechanisms put in place for a respondent to surrender a firearm, and few localities were aware or enforced this provision. So next slide. So the exciting thing that actually happened in this last General Assembly session was legislation that was passed that actually put into place some of the important steps that communities would have to take in order to actually enforce this restriction. And it also went beyond just family abuse protective orders to general district court protective orders, or all final protective orders, where a respondent is not allowed to possess, purchase, or transport a firearm, and a violation of the possess part of that statute would be a Class 6 felony. So you have the code sections up there that were amended, where what we're going to be talking about is. So these were it was Senate Bill 479, and you can see the code sections that were amended that we're going to be talking about for the remainder of this call. Okay, next slide. So here are some of the things that were put into play and the new legislation, the new laws that passed, that really created some mechanisms and some teeth into this requirement. So Senate Bill 479 requires that any petition for protective order, both family abuse and non-family abuse, shall include a provision where the petitioner may indicate whether the petitioner knows or has reason to know that the respondent owns or possesses any firearm. So there will be a change on the petition where the petitioner can note that the respondent has a firearm. And we're going to talk a lot more about this and about how we prepare petitioners and victims for how to fill out those petitions when they file. So it also requires a respondent to a family abuse or general district court final protective order to, within 24 hours of being served, to relinquish any firearm that they have, firearm or firearms, to essentially a law enforcement agency or other person allowed by law to possess a firearm. So one of the things that will also change is that one of the things that folks used to do was they might just give their firearms to their brother or hand them over to a family member. But one of the changes in this law requires that that person that they hand their guns over to has to be allowed by law to possess a firearm. It also requires that the respondent certify in writing to the court that issued the order that they have relinquished any firearm within 48 hours of service of the protective order. So in other words, the respondent to a protective order has to submit something to the court in writing that they have actually relinquished those protective orders. And failure to certify that they've relinquished those firearms, relinquish those firearms. Failure to certify that they've relinquished the firearms will result in contempt of court. So a judge can hold somebody if they fail to surrender their firearm or fail to certify that they've surrendered their firearms. Okay. Next slide. So again, these are the things that really put some teeth into the law that was passed in 2016 and also extended it to non-family abuse protective orders. So one of the things that the court is required to do is to provide to the respondent information about and an address for the designated law enforcement agency that will receive and store their firearms. So this is one of the things that we're going to have to be working on in our communities around choosing which law enforcement agency is willing to receive and store firearms. And if you don't have a law enforcement agency that's willing to do that, then where would somebody be able to take their firearms to be relinquished? And I believe DCJS has hired someone, and I believe I saw Dennis is on the call, who's going to be working with law enforcement agencies around passage of this legislation, and I hope around some of those storage issues.
Ruth, there's a quick question that showed up in the chat about that relinquishing your firearms to someone who's allowed to own. Gail's asking, does allowed to own mean that the person already has a permit, or does it mean that that person is eligible to gain a permit? And if the latter, if it just was about being eligible to gain a permit, would they have to get the permit if they accepted the firearm from the person who had to relinquish it?
Okay. Yeah, to my knowledge, you don't have to have a permit to own a firearm. You just have to be in order to have a concealed weapons permit. That's sort of a different thing. To be eligible by law means that you're not subject to a protective order yourself, that you don't have a felony conviction. I think there's a list of things that make somebody eligible to to actually possess a firearm. So you don't necessarily get a permit, but you can't be like if you're a felon, an ex-felon, if you are subject to a protective order yourself and you're not able to have a firearm. So I hope that helps. So the new law also provides protection from liability to law enforcement for any damage to any firearms that agency might store, and it minimally outlines a process for return of firearms. So that's one of the I think gaps that we've been aware of, and we might try to fix in upcoming legislative sessions. But essentially, when law enforcement will give somebody a receipt when they turn in their firearm, and then the person, when the protective order is no longer in effect, that person can go back to that law enforcement agency, give them that receipt. The law enforcement agency has to ensure that they're no longer subject to that protective order, and then they can get their firearms back. So I can see that we might have some problems in that area as we begin to implement the law. So that's definitely one of the things that we're really interested to see how that's working out and how that's playing out in communities. And then again, and I've gone over this, but it really closes that thing. You may have heard of the boyfriend loophole, and that's where this protective order, firearms restrictions did not apply to non-family abuse protective orders. So this legislation also really closes that boyfriend loophole, which is what it's been called, and extends these restrictions to anybody subject to a final protective order. Okay, next slide, Laurel. So we really wanted to spend some time talking about implementation and how these new restrictions are implemented in your communities. So one of the first things that we feel like it's really important for advocates to be aware of and know is to make sure that victims understand that these laws are in effect prior to petitioning for protective orders and in their consideration of petitioning for protective orders. In many instances, this could be the thing that really agitates or makes the respondent in the protective order or the abuser really agitated and could increase the risks to a victim if somebody feels like their ability to possess their firearms is being threatened. So, and I think most victim advocates understand this and understand the importance of victims knowing that once a protective order is issued, that the abuser will be required to surrender their firearms, and really think about that in terms of safety planning, particularly within that 48-hour period. One of the big pieces that we really encourage community advocates and CCRs to think about and work on is what's the role that you can play in your community around educating the public about the connections between intimate partner violence and firearms. I mean, I know that if folks pay any attention to the news, if you were paying attention to what was happening at the General Assembly during the passage of these bills, that there is a lot of resistance. There was a lot of resistance to passing any kind of bills that restricted access to firearms. And there are a significant group of folks who really are not opposed to that if somebody should not be subject to possessing a firearm. So we really feel like one of the ways that we're going to be able to implement these laws at the local level is to be sure and do good public awareness campaigns and education campaigns around the dangers of firearms where intimate partner violence is happening. And one of the other issues that has come up around this is, I don't know if folks have paid attention in past legislative sessions, there have been bills that have somewhat encouraged victims to purchase firearms if they are victims of violence. And we have, the Action Alliance has opposed those bills because of the understanding about just the presence of firearms increasing that risk to individuals. So please get out and talk to your communities, educate yourself about those connections, and get out there and talk to your communities about those dangers. It's going to be really important to actively participate in your local CCRs or any community initiative that has formed to implement the passage of these laws. So one of the things that often happens is the courts and law enforcement aren't communicating and aren't talking. And we can play, advocates can play a big role in bringing that conversation together. And if the judges are saying you have to surrender your firearms within 24 hours, and yet we don't know where you surrender them, then that's a problem. So we really want to be players in bringing all of these pieces together in our community. And then I think the last and most important thing around implementation is that we are monitoring and paying attention to the impact. Is this happening in your community? Are firearms being surrendered? Is it impacting whether or not judges are issuing protective orders? Has it changed whether the courts are issuing protective orders in any way? Is it changed whether victims are willing to ask for protection, or if they're concerned that having these restrictions will increase or enhance the danger that they may be facing? So we really want to pay attention to how it's playing out, how it's working in your community, and we really want to hear from you about the impact of these as they're getting implemented. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we really feel like any conversation about the new firearms restrictions include conversation around how this might change or impact safety planning with victims. So prior to filling in a petition or prior to filing a petition, if you are working with somebody, please let them know that the respondent, if the protective order is issued, that the respondent is going to be required to surrender their firearms. Really important information for victims to consider when they are filing the petition. Now there's a change on the petition where the little box where the petitioner can request firearm relief. And I'll just let folks know that we really went back and forth around whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, whether that would be a helpful thing, since firearm relief is going to happen whether or not they request it. And so folks need to understand that even if they request firearm relief, the respondent is going to have to surrender their firearms. And it's really important that victims understand this. It's really important that you're having discussions and conversations with victims about how it will be implemented, and not just what the law says, which the law states that they have 24 hours to surrender or dispose of their firearms and 48 hours to file that they've a certification that they have surrendered their firearms. So these are two probably danger points for victims, where somebody actually has to surrender their firearms. They have 24 hours to do that. And then they actually have to go back to court and file that they have surrendered those firearms. And it's important that victims understand what that process is. So one of the things that I really encourage you to do if you're not in court every day, but is to make sure that you understand how your locality is implementing this. And if they're implementing it according to the law, and you're able to talk to victims about exactly what will happen. I think it's also really important to let them know that, I'm sorry, I was reading the chat. I'm going to wait on that and keep going, and then we can point out what's there. That it is a Class 6 felony for somebody who's a respondent in a protective order to actually possess a firearm. So that Class 6 felony is a pretty high bar. So understanding that it's not just that they'll be charged with a misdemeanor for violation of a protective order, they're actually going to be charged with a Class 6 felony, or could be charged with a Class 6 felony that may involve jail time. So again, something that's important to have a conversation with the victim about, so that they understand what may happen as a result. And again, it's just really important that you go over all the provisions of a protective order when you're doing your safety planning with victims, and having a conversation with folks about, how does your partner feel about their firearms? Is this something that's going to really increase their anger? How can we keep you safe during this 48-hour period? Do they have access to other firearms? So really having some discussion around guns and what's going on. Okay, I'm just reading your yeah. So thanks, Jonathan. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what you might have to be engaged in, and what your role as a systems advocate may be as you're working in your community to implement some of these provisions. You're going to have to really understand that there are communities that are going to struggle with implementing these laws. And I think particularly rural communities, where there may not be a law enforcement agency who is willing to store firearms or to accept firearms. So really having to work with them to think about that. So making ourselves available to help with the implementation, I think, is an important aspect of making these things work. Make sure you're at the table. If there's a CCR, if there's a small group that's getting together to talk about implementation, ask to be involved in that. Make sure you understand what the process is, that as part of your role as an advocate, it's vital that you understand exactly what's going to happen related to the implementation. And share information. What will you do? How are we going to let victims know who don't utilize our services? Particularly around protective orders that are petitions in the general district court, so non-family abuse petitions, where folks can just go in and ask the clerk for information, and the clerk gives them the petition to file. How are we going to share that information with them about protective orders? So one of the things that having some type of, whether it's a brochure or a sheet of paper that you ask the clerks to give out when they're giving the petition, that outline what the firearm restrictions are, so that victims understand what's going to happen. We are working on developing a toolkit for communities around things that you can use in your community to work on implementation. So hopefully we'll be able to get that out in the first of the year as communities are implementing this. Okay. Next. So just a few things to think about as you are implementing the protective order process in your community. And this is something that I think communities did a really good job with a number of years ago. And it wouldn't hurt for every community to put together some sort of protective order implementation work group. If you don't have a CCR, or if you do have a CCR, having a committee or an ad hoc group that's working on protective order implementation. You want to make sure you have your court services representatives at the table and your general district court clerks. It's important that you are talking with law enforcement and understanding how they're going to enforce this new law. It's probably good to listen to some conversations and to get a good sense of what's the general feeling about law enforcement and implementing this. Do the law enforcement officers that you currently work with, are they aware of it? How is your local law enforcement agency going to be getting information out to all of their deputies and officers, and getting a good sense of how they plan to implement it. How will respondents be informed? So we do understand that OES is looking at creating something for the courts to use. I think right now each individual court is doing their own thing. How are we going to make sure that respondents understand that they could be charged with a Class 6 felony if they don't surrender their firearms, and that the importance of coming back and certifying that they have done that. So we really want to put some mechanisms in place that give respondents that information. And then what about where a respondent is not at the protective order hearing and is served by law enforcement, or is given the protective order by law enforcement? They're not in a court hearing. How's law enforcement going to communicate that information to the respondent? And I assume that we'll be working with DCJS on what are their recommended policies around service. It is a dangerous thing for law enforcement officers to show up at somebody's house or serve a protective order and then say, oh, and by the way, you have to surrender your firearms. And I think there are many law enforcement officers who are going to be reluctant to do that because it will increase the potential danger for them as well. So it's really important that we're having those discussions within our CCRs or our communities. And of course, you want to know who's going to be the designated law enforcement agency in your community and what's the process that they're going to have in place for receiving firearms. So again, that is something that local law enforcement agencies are going to have to decide. And in some jurisdictions, you may have multiple law enforcement agencies. And the legislation really encourages that it be a designated law enforcement agency in the community that's going to be accepting firearms. So this is lots of the information that communities are going to have to be grappling with, and that advocates are going to need to know, and that we're going to be able to share this information with victims and possibly with respondents. Okay, next slide. And then we absolutely, and I talked about this in an earlier slide, but I think we really want to pay attention to the effectiveness of this legislation. So we're really interested and want to know how communities are implementing this, and I think communities can learn from one another. So I know we work with a lot of communities around the state who there's some that do a really good job and have been implementing firearms restrictions really well and notifying respondents and have storage places, and it's working better than in some areas that aren't doing anything to implement this, or where judges may not even be issuing protective orders because they don't believe that people should have to surrender their firearms. So these are all things to pay attention to and share information about. How do we know if it makes victims safer? You know, there certainly are times when an abuser who's required to surrender their firearms, that feels like such a violation to them that it increases the danger and reduces the safety that we were intending to increase. So we really want to have conversations with victims. We want to pay attention to whether or not this is helping to make victims safer and feel safer and actually be safer. Does it impact the number of protective orders that are issued? So do judges seem to be less reluctant to issue protective orders because whether they have concerns about the gun restrictions, or I know I've had conversations with a lot of advocates over the years in rural jurisdictions where a judge would say, you know, they didn't want to issue a protective order because the respondent or the abuser hunted and it was hunting season and they weren't going to do something to restrict their gun, or they issued the protective order and wrote on the order that gun restrictions didn't apply. Things like that. So we want to know about what's happening in your community and if it's affecting the number of protective orders that are issued. And just to think about what are some of the other questions we may have as these laws are implemented. What are some of the gaps that weren't addressed in this legislation? We really want to invite you to share with us at the Action Alliance about what's happening in your community. You can send an email, you can call, and we're going to give you some numbers at the end of this to do that. This is new stuff. Sometimes it takes communities a while to figure out how to implement it, but once implementation is in place and things are happening, we really are curious about the impact and how this is working for folks. Okay, so I wanted to share these links with you. These are some places where if you want to do an education campaign in your locality, where you can get some information, where there are folks that, thanks for adding that too, where there's lots of implementation information that can help you as you're working on this in your local community. So the Battered Women's Justice Project has a program called Safer Families, Safer Communities Project, which is a lot of information and support around implementing the firearms restrictions in your community. We gave you the website for disarmdv.org, which has a lot of information about the connections between intimate partner violence and firearms. So you can follow up with that and get some information. The Giffords Law Center at giffords.org Law Center is actually working with us in Virginia around implementation, but they have a lot of resources and support and help around implementing the firearms restrictions for communities. And at the Action Alliance, we have a firearms work group who is looking at implementation in Virginia and what are some of the things that we need to have in place in order to implement these restrictions and hopefully have it be a smooth process and make sure that both victims and respondents have the information they need to be able to comply with the restrictions on the orders. So yeah, if there are folks who are interested in participating in the work group, you can contact Jonathan Iglesias, and you have Jonathan's email here, or myself, and you've got my email address. Or if you have questions, we'll provide technical assistance to your CCR or to your courts or to law enforcement. I know DCJS is going to be working with law enforcement agencies and communities around the state, around implementation. So it would be my hope that we can have a team of folks who can come into a community. We can have somebody from OES, the Office of the Executive Secretary, someone from DCJS, someone from the Action Alliance, to go work with community teams around implementation. But to let you know that there is a lot available and a lot happening to help communities implement these restrictions more effectively. You know, we also do anticipate some backlash. So I think it's important to have your ear to the ground and to be aware about how folks in your community are feeling about these firearm restrictions, and that you're talking with law enforcement, Commonwealth's attorneys. And yeah, Sushila Varkey from VPLC just shared something in the chat around asking these questions around how folks are implementing these laws in your community. And then that was also about, yes, so I was going to mention the substantial risk order is also one of the new laws that was passed. So you probably want to have some conversation with law enforcement and your Commonwealth's attorney around the often called the red flag, ERPO, the substantial risk order that will remove firearms from anyone who may be posing a threat to themselves or others in your community. And that new law is probably on the list that Jonathan gave you, the link that Jonathan put in the chat. So that is actually one of the new laws that was passed that allows a magistrate or a Commonwealth attorney or at the request of law enforcement, I think. I don't have all, Sush, if you want to add what the requirements for that substantial risk protective order are, but only a Commonwealth attorney or magistrate can ask for that, is my understanding.
It's, can you guys hear me? It's basically the Commonwealth attorney or law enforcement has to request it, and it has to be, I'm looking for my notes, by clear and convincing evidence that the respondent poses a substantial risk of injury to himself or others in the near future by purchasing, possessing, or transporting the firearm. And the reason I'm mentioning it here as another question to ask, Ruth was talking about protective orders and the fact that when petitioners ask for it, they're going to get firearms relief whether they want it or not, right? So if getting a protective order, if the reason the person is getting a protective order is because they're especially worried about firearms, but they don't want to be perceived by the respondent as taking away their firearms, working with law enforcement or the Commonwealth's attorney to ask for a substantial risk order may be a better route. That's why I brought it up here.
Yeah, thank you, Sushila. Yeah, and so that's why it's important as advocates that we know what is available and what relief is available, and are having these conversations with folks prior to petitioning for orders, so that we are able to help them or guide them in the direction of what might be the best relief that's available, because there are some new tools that are available for folks. Yeah, so we really, really encourage you to get engaged in your community conversation, in your CCR. If you don't have a CCR, to start one, to get one going in your community. We are here, Action Alliance will provide support with that. We work closely with DCJS, with the Virginia Poverty Law Center, the Attorney General's office, to come out and work with you in your community on establishing a protective order response, or a coordinated community response. And just a lot of these changes really give rise to the importance of getting together in your community and talking about safe ways to implement. So I think there's one more slide. Is there one more slide, Laurel? Two more. There's a check-in question. Okay. So yeah, so I've just been rambling off a lot of information for you. So we just want to connect and see if your comfortability has changed a little bit, if I made you more uncomfortable or less comfortable around the firearms laws. So if you can take out do your little annotation stamp.
It's looking a lot better this time.
Yeah, yeah. So we've definitely got more folks up top. That's always helpful. Sometimes I go to a training or a webinar and I thought I knew what I was talking about, and then I go and I realize, whoa, I'm less comfortable than when I started here. I just found out what I didn't know. So yeah, well, good. We know that there are a lot of pieces to understanding these, to implementing them effectively and safely in our communities. I hope this will sort of encourage folks to seek out some training around safety planning, because I think these are really important conversations that we have with victims, and how that might impact their safety. I think everybody, if you live in Virginia, you know that there are a lot of strong feelings around firearms, and they're on a broad continuum. So important to really be paying attention to how this is being implemented, and if it's actually being a tool that's utilized and that's helpful. Well, good. It looks like some folks are feeling a lot better. I think a lot of folks might have me rambling in the background. So one more slide. So yeah, this is an opportunity. We do have some folks on this call that might be able to answer your questions. And Dennis, I'm gonna take this as an opportunity. We haven't personally met yet, but to introduce yourself, if you would like to unmute yourself and say hello to folks, because I think you'll be working with a lot of these folks.
Sure. Afternoon, everyone. I am Dennis Prophet. Most people just call me Denny. I've recently come to DCJS, and my main focus is mandated from the General Assembly on, basically, I'll be developing some training education program for the emergency substantial risk order and substantial risk order that came in legislation that we mentioned earlier. So that's my main focus. I think a lot of what you talked about today with protective orders still falls within my bailiwick, but so I believe, I'm 4 days into the job. So I come from law enforcement. I got 20 years law enforcement. So I do have some experience dealing with protective orders and a lot that you discussed, a lot of experience, unfortunately, dealing with those. But so I think it brings something to the table. As far as me getting something out, my plan is, again, there's no timeline, but my plan is to first focus just to get something out to law enforcement on, give them, a training module or something on, substantial risk orders and the emergency substantial risk orders. And then maybe from there, build on something that's more geared towards, like the victims groups and other groups like that are not on the law enforcement side, but need the information on what they need to know about those and what they can do to utilize that to help them with whatever they have going on, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you, and welcome, Dennis. We look forward to working with you on implementing these.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and so again, just to let folks know that there are folks who can help with implementation and getting out information and answering your questions at the local level. So yeah, feel free to utilize and ask and follow up. And so just wanted to check and see if we had any questions from today's presentation or things that you feel like you might need more information on. And you can either unmute yourself and ask, or you can put it in the chat if you're more comfortable doing that. So I feel like maybe we should have some music while we all sort of waiting to see if we have questions.
You don't want to sing for us, Ruth?
If I had brought my guitar, I might be willing to do that, but yeah.
Well, while people are potentially writing some questions in the chat, one thing that I wanted to plug for folks is I'm putting a link to an evaluation for this call series in the chat box right now. We would love to get your feedback on how you feel that this training series went, and if it, what was the most valuable part of it for you, and if you learned some new things. So I'm putting that link in the chat for folks, and I would encourage folks to fill that out so we know what works about, we're still figuring out distance learning as we go along. So your feedback's really, really helpful. And I'll also send that out in the follow-up email with the session recording and the slide deck for today.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Laurel. Yeah, absolutely. Please take a few minutes to fill out your evaluation. We haven't done a lot of protective order training recently, and I know that when those of us who put these trainings together, Caitlin Bradley from the Action Alliance, our legal services section, and Sushila Varkey from the Virginia Poverty Law Center. I want to acknowledge both of you and thank you for your work on this protective order series. I want to thank Laurel Windsor from the Action Alliance for your technical support and assistance and doing these. So, yeah, thank you all for making these happen. And we would really welcome your feedback on if you would like more information. We are doing most of our training online right now. I'll speak for myself. I will go out and do training in localities as long as we have, sort of low numbers of folks and we're doing social distancing and mask wearing and things like that. So I have been going out and doing some small group trainings. So we're available to do that if that would be helpful. And Sush, I don't know if you wanted to say anything. Oh, sorry, Laurel, go ahead.
I was going to say, I also wanted to thank Kristen Vimenta for tech help. They were here on the first training and I wasn't here that day. So thank you, Kristen. And there is a question in the chat. Felicia was asking if you could give an example of evidence that would be presented to a Commonwealth attorney for a substantial risk order.
Sure, I'm gonna turn that question over to Sushila and Dennis. If there are things that you all are aware of, my understanding is that somebody who may be exhibiting threatening behavior, somebody who might be having a mental health experience where they are seeming to not be in control of their capacity, themselves, that those are examples. Do you guys have other examples of what you might take to a Commonwealth attorney?
All right, I'll jump in. Just kicking on from my law enforcement experiences, reading over the code, just a couple of things to keep in mind on it. You got to focus on some of the details where it talks about it's probable cause. So it is a probable cause standard, and it's got to be something that shows that they're a risk of danger to themselves or somebody else in the near future. So it needs to be something relatively recent or that they're threatening something coming, if you will. But as opposed to presenting to the Commonwealth attorney, you more than likely would be presenting to a law enforcement agency, unless you just had a working relationship with that CA for some, because the Commonwealth attorney is more than likely going to defer, because anytime you petition for one of these, it has to be vetted and investigated by law enforcement. So I think most times it's going to be, if it goes to a CA, they're going to send it over to law enforcement. But things that you would present, text messages, if you have a recorded phone call for some reason, social media is the biggest. Social media, if you see things on social media that are threatening, that are alluding to threats or violence, that's things that they need to see. And with the nice thing about having law enforcement investigate it is it's not like you have to present your federal case and you've got to give just a little bit of evidence to law enforcement or a Commonwealth attorney, go, this person is displaying violence. I think they're a danger with their firearms. And that now puts the burden on them to conduct that investigation. Of course, the more you give them, the more they have to go on, but they're going to do the investigation on it and basically build that case to go before the magistrate or a judge to present their probable cause. But definitely social media is huge. If you have access to social media, you get that. If you're seeing it on social media, of course, any correspondence, letters, things like that. And then just their own behavior, things that they're saying, things that they're acting, if they're acting out of sorts. All those things are things that you want to be able to relay to that Commonwealth attorney or to the law enforcement agency.
So I don't have anything to add, not ever having been a Commonwealth's attorney or a law enforcement or worked in criminal law. But I will say that in order to get the first emergency substantial risk order, the law enforcement has to make a voluntary request for the person to relinquish their firearms. It's only after that voluntary request, if there's a probable cause to believe that they still have firearms, that they could then get a warrant to get those firearms. So that's something I think people should know about. And in answer to the actual question, I think this is a good thing to talk to your law enforcement and Commonwealth's attorneys about. What evidence would you see as appropriate for me to bring to your attention to ask for that emergency and then longer substantial risk order?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
thing that I would, oops, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say one thing that I would add. I can't remember exact numbers or anything, but just in our conversations with the folks at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence and the Giffords Law Center, one of the things that they have relayed to us is that in those states who have had a similar piece of legislation that's passed and being implemented, and some have had that for up to a year now, there have not been too many of these orders that have been filed and that have been implemented. And so I think that the standard of evidence is slightly different in most states. And I would be curious to know, and this is something that we can certainly ask our partners, I'd be curious to know just exactly what the answer to your question is, what it looks like in other states, because I'm guessing Virginia might be slightly different. And Dennis's answer really makes a lot of sense. And I'm not sure that Virginia always follows the precedent set by other states when it comes to these things. So would be curious just to know how it's looked in other states, and I'd be happy to find some of that info and share that if that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, so I think we're all going to be on somewhat of a learning curve as we go forward with many of these new laws. So we are interested in hearing what's happening in your community. If you have a conversation with law enforcement or folks in your CCR about both of these protective order pieces of legislation and how it's going to be implemented, please send Jonathan or myself an email or give us a call at the Action Alliance, because we really want to be engaged in how this is working across the Commonwealth, and what are some of the things that, what are some of the tools that we could bring in to be helpful around implementation. And again, I will reiterate what I talked about at the beginning. We've been working with some folks from the Giffords Law Center, and one of the things that one of the staff members there has recommended to us in Virginia, and I'm passing this along for you in communities, is we really need to get information out to the general public, do some campaigns. Domestic Violence Awareness Month starts today. Writing letters to your editor, doing articles in the newspaper, whatever you can do to get information out to the general public about the connections between firearms and intimate partner violence. And the dangers there, so that people understand why this is such an important, why these are such important laws to be paying attention to and implementing effectively. So yeah. So if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to stop talking. And encourage you again to complete the evaluation. And thank you all for participating. And I wish you good luck in your communities and stay safe. And thank you for all your help, Sush and Dennis and Jonathan, on sharing information with folks. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.